Indigenous peoples in Canada have long faced violations of their fundamental rights, particularly through the residential school system. This system began in the 1800s with the intent to forcibly assimilate Indigenous children into European culture. These schools stripped over 150,000 children of their language, culture, and families, erasing their identities. This documentary explores the legacy of residential schools, the rights that were denied, and the responsibility we carry today. The right to cultural identity is fundamental, and it is our responsibility to respect, preserve, and educate ourselves about different cultures. The legacy of residential schools highlights what happens when this right is denied, emphasizing the need to acknowledge past injustices and uphold cultural rights today.
Advancing to meet human rights goals.
The phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," originated in the United States but reflects the ideology behind residential schools in Canada as well. Coined by Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of the first boarding school for Indigenous children in the U.S. This slogan captured the assimilationist mindset that justified these institutions. It implied that Indigenous identity needed to be erased for individuals to be civilized, a process seen as saving them from their own culture.
South of Hudson's Bay, James Bay, and at the southern tip of James Bay, the settlement of Moose Factory. News Magazine salutes Education Week with films of an Indian residential school 500 miles north of Toronto.
In Canada, the same sentiment shaped the residential school system. Children were separated from their families and forced to abandon their languages, cultural practices, and ways of life. The goal was clear: to destroy Indigenous cultures under the guise of helping them integrate into Canadian society. The residential school system began in 1831 with the Mohawk Institute in Ontario, Canada. The Indian Act of 1876 gave the government control over Indigenous lives and paved the way for mandatory assimilation policies. By 1920, attendance at residential schools became compulsory, forcing thousands of children to leave their families and cultures behind. The system operated for over a century with more than 150,000 children placed in these schools. By the time the last residential school closed in 1996, the damage to Indigenous communities was immense. These schools were designed not to educate but to erase Indigenous identity, implementing cultural genocide under the authority of the Indian Act.
The residential school system took away my language, my culture, and my identity. I'm a residential school survivor from the Cree community of Moose Factory, Ontario. My mom and dad were hunters and trappers, and we survived off the land. Cree was spoken around the house, was pretty much it. And I went to residential school. I went to residential school when I was 7 years old. The Department of Indian Affairs had a policy, and every child had to attend residential school. So my parents would go to jail if I didn't go to school.
Residential schools tore children away from their families, forbidding them from speaking their languages or from practicing their traditions. Many faced physical and emotional abuse for resisting, while others suffered neglect in overcrowded, poorly funded institutions. More than 6,000 children are believed to have died, with many buried in unmarked graves. Survivors face lifelong trauma, and the effects of the system are still felt today, contributing to the cycles of poverty and loss in the Indigenous communities.
When I found out not to speak Cree, and yet we didn't understand English. When we first went there, they took all our clothes off, and we turned kind of, when they I remember getting a bald head, they cut off all your hair. Put that TTT on your head there and all over your body there. Figured that we were lousy or had lice, I guess, I don't know. I remember that one. Told us not to speak Cree, try to understand English. Every time we spoke Cree there, we'd get they had a little stick, a willow. That's where we used to get. They had straps. I seen them that they had straps. The supervisors. But every time you spoke Cree, they would, they would either spank you, and sometimes you didn't go for supper just for speaking Cree.
In 2008, the Canadian government issued a formal apology for the harm caused by residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to document the stories of survivors and make recommendations for moving forward. Its 94 calls to action outline steps for addressing the legacy of the residential schools and supporting Indigenous communities. Reconciliation is not just about the government's responsibility. It is a shared obligation. It requires all Canadians to learn about this history, to listen to survivors, and to support Indigenous-led efforts for healing and justice.
Life was really good to us before the residential school. People were close and helped each other, and they lived off the land, and they knew everything about the land, and they were very strong people. They're survivors, even through the harsh winters, and they knew what they had to do to survive and live on the lands, and they teach their children at a very young age. In the old days, the aunts were expected to teach the girls, and the uncles were responsible for teaching the boys. And so they had a system, the traditional way, that really worked for them. And they practiced that until the white people came up this country.
Despite efforts to erase Indigenous identity, many communities are reclaiming their culture and independence. The First Nations University of Canada plays a big part in this by offering education that helps Indigenous students reconnect with their traditions, focusing on things like language, governance, and cultural studies.
Well, if you're looking at traditional Indigenous society, the elders were sort of like the spiritual leaders and the counselors and the healers. And of course, spirituality was very important in our societies because we believe that was one of the most important things that people had to live by, was their spirituality. And so the elders were called on in various circumstances, to perform ceremonies, to provide counseling, to provide healing. So that usually occurred in a small community, and there were good supports for them in that community, in terms of making sure their welfare was taken care of.
The video playing now is from the 2013 Gathering of Nations powwow, one of the largest and most well-known powwows in North America. Powwows are a celebration of Indigenous culture, bringing together nations from across the continent to share traditions, honor ancestors, and pass down cultural knowledge. These gatherings feature drumming, singing, and a variety of traditional dances, each with a deep meaning and history. In this clip, young dancers known as Tiny Tots take the floor, proudly wearing their regalia. Tiny Tots is a non-competitive category for the youngest dancers, encouraging them to take part in their culture from an early age. But powwows also include many other dance categories like fancy shawl, jingle dress, grass dance, and men's traditional, each with its own story and style of movement. Dancers are often judged on their technique, regalia, and connection to the drum, which represents the heartbeat of the earth. More than just a competition, powwows serve as a space for Indigenous people to gather as a community, reconnect with their roots, and keep their traditions alive. Events like the Gathering of Nations are a reminder that Indigenous culture is not just history, it's living, evolving, and thriving today. The story of residential schools is a reminder of what happens when rights are ignored and responsibilities are abandoned. But it is also a story of resilience and hope. Indigenous peoples continue to reclaim their identities and fight for their rights, proving that culture cannot be erased. By understanding and sharing these stories, we can make sure they're not forgotten. Together we can create a future where every culture is valued and everyone's rights are protected.